When General Motors issued a recall notice over a deadly ignition switch defect this February, it triggered the largest series of automotive recalls ever. Almost 30 million GM cars so far. GM has acknowledged that dozens of people died as a result of that defect, and some Canadian families say their loved ones should be included in that toll. The Fifth Estate's Bob McKeown reports in GM Recall, the Switch from Hell, that GM knew about the problem for years and kept it a secret.
On this edition of the Fifth Estate,
We have a warning for you tonight.
it was General Motors' deadly secret.
What happened to this GM car? Crappy little Cobalt.
Now a startling look inside the GM culture that put a price on their customers' lives.
GM made a business decision not to fix these safety defects.
The dead Canadians who might have been saved.
He died for a 57-cent piece that should have been fixed over 10 years ago.
And the life or death question, what's Transport Canada doing to protect you?
It's incumbent upon the manufacturer to let Transport Canada know about a defect in a timely fashion.
That's right.
Is it almost a decade and a half in timely fashion?
That is an excerpt from GM Recall, the Switch from Hell on the Fifth Estate. The reporter who has led the investigation, Bob McKeown, with me this morning, and thank you for coming in.
Good morning.
What happens, just so we understand this clearly, what happens in GM cars that have this defective switch?
This is what's called a detent plunger. It's a tiny part that's in the ignition switch of compact cars like the Chevy Cobalt and the Saturn Ion. And what's been happening now for a decade and a half since this part was put into the first compact car is that it's not long enough. It was manufactured 1.6 millimeters too short. That's about the width of a quarter to keep the key in place. And the consequence is that the key can slip, the car can turn off at high speed potentially, losing all power for brakes, for steering, and if there's a crash, for airbags. And as you say, GM acknowledges over the past 15 years, while it kept this a secret, at least 29 people have died. But it's received claims so far for 150 deaths.
So you're looking at where Canada figures in this problem. So what did Transport Canada know about this switch, and what did it do?
Well, exactly. GM has acknowledged, as I say, that they knew about this as far back as 2001 when they designed the switch. Kept it secret because they say someone made the decision it would be too expensive to recall and repair all those cars. People died. We set out to find out how Transport Canada deals with a situation like this. It's our automotive regulator. Motor Vehicle Safety Act is the legislation it uses. Transport Canada has said, since the recall in February, which is widely publicized, Transport Canada has said, Lisa Raitt in Parliament, that it only found out when GM told it about the recall on February the 10th, 2014. Through Freedom of Information, we went back through Transport Canada's files, and we found that there was an accident which had the earmarks of an ignition switch fatal crash in Quebec in June 2013. Young man named Danny Dubuc-Marquis, Chevy Cobalt. His airbags did not deploy in a head-on collision. He died, and investigators found the switch in the off position, which is what happens when this ignition issue takes place. Transport Canada knew that within days. We've got their files. Their investigators were obviously contemplating the link between the ignition in the off position and the failure of the airbags to deploy. They had email, they had phone communication. In October, they had a complaint session with General Motors, which presumably talked about the ignition switch. And then for some reason, this is all 8 months before the recall, for some reason they dropped it. They stopped their investigation. They took Danny's wrecked car, put it in a nearby junkyard in the Eastern Townships, and that was that, until February, when GM announced the recall. Now, the key to that is that through all that period, there were almost 400,000 cars with that potentially deadly ignition switch on Canadian roads.
Okay. I guess the key question would be, what can Transport Canada do in a situation like this?
And that's one of the big surprises in this story. I think most of us assume that, as in the U.S., regulators here can order cars to be recalled if there's a potentially lethal safety defect. Under the Motor Vehicle Safety Act in Canada, Transport Canada can't do that. The best they can do is to request that a manufacturer recall a specific car. The manufacturer, like GM, can decline. And if that's the case, they're bound for potentially years in court. So nothing usually is what happens. In the US, there are 2 ongoing congressional investigations. The CEO of GM has been summoned to Capitol Hill to testify twice. There's a Department of Justice investigation. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has fined GM the maximum allowed by law in the US. In Canada so far, Transport Canada has taken no official action whatsoever.
The Fifth Estate investigating, and it's an extraordinary story and an important one to tell. Bob, thank you.